So I thought since we've already had a conversation a week ago, this time you should directly be in conversation with our guests at the dialogue. So I don't really want to be in the way, but perhaps just to warm it up, let me ask you, as you move to December and assuming the presidency of the G20, what for you are the key big questions the G20 needs to respond to today? And of course, what are the big challenges for the G20 to be effective today?
So, Samir, thanks for having me here. And I really, great pleasure to be in the midst of your guests. The world is in the midst of multiple and compounding crises: global health, global economic stability, food and energy security, and achievement of the SDG agenda are all under stress. The pandemic has pushed millions of people in the developing world into poverty, hunger, debt, and this has exposed the gaping wide gap between the developed and the developing world. And therefore, our view is that the need of the hour is really accelerated growth, and we need a coordinated collective response that is able to push growth, provide also relief to a vast segment of people with impact, scale, and speed. And only the promise, if we are able to keep the promise of growth, it will reaffirm faith in the multilateral system that has served the world well over the past many decades. And I feel that this is a real pivotal moment, as for the first time since its inception, the reins of the G20 are being held by three developing nations: Indonesia, India, and Brazil. And the G20 is a very critical forum which has time and again dealt with global crisis by reforming and redesigning the international financial structures and overseeing the development of norms and practices of multilateral development banks as well as the central banks. So when we take over the presidency of G20 later this year, we are committed to embedding the concerns of the developing world at the heart of the G20 agenda. And for us, the developing world is very, very critical. Our presidency in 2023 will also coincide with the UN Summit of the Future, the biennial summit of the UN with G20, the SDGs summit, and most importantly, the midway review of the 2030 SDG agenda. We feel that this is an opportune time to reflect on the progress made on SDGs so far and inject fresh political and economic stimulus into them, because they have faced neglect in recent years. The development concerns of our African friends, much like our own, must form the bedrock of the G20 consensus. We feel that the institutions for international development are not serving the needs of the developing world. And as one of the themes of this dialogue reflects, that time is ripe for rethinking international cooperation, development finance, and governance models for sustainable development. With this vision in mind, our presidency will take forward the political dialogue towards tangible outcomes that cater to the needs of the developing world and build global consensus on the idea of reformed multilateralism, which to our mind is essential for rebuilding resilient nations, societies, and individuals. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, has given out the clarion call to the world with the mantra of life, that is lifestyles for the environment, that emphasizes the importance of behavioral change and individual responsibility in building a global resilient community of pro-planet people. Life is about building a global movement for transforming modern societies that are hardwired to mindless, wasteful overconsumption by promoting mindful consumption and making people pro-planet and ingraining green habits in individuals around the world. This small step, when taken up at a global scale, has the power to transform our world and fight climate change more effectively. You know, India and African nations collectively have the highest percentage of young population in the world. This demographic dividend requires us all to be mindful of our responsibilities to ensure that this youthful population achieves its highest potential in these very testing times. What works to our great advantage is the fact that this is also a digital generation that is more connected, more innovative, and wiser than ever before. India stands committed to harnessing the potential of youth by investments into digital public goods, technological innovation and growth. And India has made great strides in this sector and at the G20 platform. We really wish to take the fruits of our collective labor global by promoting cross-border flows of digital technology and investments. And, you know, Africa today accounts for 17% of the global population and 4% of the world economy. And I have no doubt that the African nations will only grow further, higher and lead the world with the vision of development and just transitions over the coming decades. Our long-standing friendship and shared vision of a just, prosperous, and equitable world means that the glorious continent of Africa will be the closest to the hearts and minds of 1 billion plus strong Indians as we host the G20 nations next year. This is a moment of great pride for us, and we invite you all to be part of our presidency so that we can collectively steer the world towards peace, prosperity, and sustainable living. I'm very excited about the pillars and themes of the Kigali dialogue of building resilient societies, climate change, commerce and creativity, development and digital connectivity. We share exactly the same vision and concerns as you, and I invite you all to give us your ideas and suggestions that can contribute to making our G presidency a truly global success, with Africa playing a key role.
Thank you,
very
sir.
much.
And thank you for that opening, rather broad sweep of the ambitions that you are seeking to imbibe into your presidency. What I will do is I'll very quickly move to our participants here, sir, and I'll let them pose questions to you. Let me first invite Honorable Mohammad Anwar Husnu, Vice Prime Minister of Mauritius, who is with us at the Kigali Dialogue, and perhaps we should kick it off with you, sir. Maybe you can use my mic here.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you about one question. Basically now, you know, Mauritius, here in this global dialogue, there are 3 countries from SIDS are represented here, like Seychelles, Maldives, and Mauritius. In major discussion, in all the kind of major groups discussion, sometimes I get the impression that SID countries are being neglected. Whereas they are the ones that suffers most from climate change, from global warming. Firstly, I want to ask you, is SIDS countries are on the agenda of India when you're going to take over the G20, number one? And secondly, SIDS, I mean, with global warming, we have a lot of issues. It affects agriculture, food security, health, obviously with new emerging diseases, but our infrastructure. Now, in Mauritius, I'll give an example. For example, in Mauritius, we have only one port, one seaport, and one airport. In case we have a major disaster, the airport is blocked for one reason or the other, it is not, we can't use it. And now we know what we have gone through with the COVID when there was lockdown, and we know what we went through. So what can be done to help us, to help our infrastructure, to make the infrastructure more kind of resilient to disaster in the future come.
So is the CDRI agenda going to find place in the G20? Are we going to push for disaster resilient infrastructure investments, mobilizing more capital? I think that's the question for small island nations.
So that's a very, very important question, and I totally agree with much of what the Deputy Prime Minister has said, and I entirely agree that climate change is at the heart of G20 next year. As we move on, because many of these countries are not responsible for the pollution that has taken place in the world, but they will be the worst sufferers, and therefore all that the developed world has committed to, while they have been committing from COP1 to COP26, a vast range of financing for the developing world, they have not lived up to that commitment. And therefore, our belief is that G20 provides the best forum of both developed and developing world to really push the agenda of climate change, push the climate agenda of climate finance, and push the agenda of ensuring that countries like Mauritius are fully helped as far as climate change is concerned and in terms of creation of infrastructure. We have separately worked towards creating a new working group on disaster resilience, where we'll discuss these key issues and take them forward so that we work in a spirit of partnership to assist all these very endangered countries together. We look forward to a very close partnership with Mauritius in taking this agenda of disaster resilience forward.
Mr. Kant, I'm now going to turn to Honorable Mohammed Nasheed, Speaker of the People's Majlis, Maldives, and of course the former president and a climate evangelist in some sense. So, President, over to you.
Thank you, sir, and congratulations to India on becoming the chair of the G20. Climate change obviously is going to be the single most important issue for us in the coming years. My question is, now before I ask my question, countries like the Maldives, Mauritius, and other climate vulnerable countries, which are 52 in number, I think, we spend almost 30% of our income on adaptation and another 25% on debt repayment. So we have very little funds available to do anything else. Now, how would G20 bring the money to climate vulnerable countries? The green transition that we want to do, and without that, it's going to be impossible to see a huge Africa rising up. Without renewable energy, without sustainability in environmental issues, it's going to be impossible for us to see the rapid change that we want to witness. Especially private sector finance, how green bonds can be made to work and made more open to everyone, and also how we can swap our debt to environment conservation and the benefits of conserving and therefore swapping the debt for it. How would you go about bringing these ideas into the G20 talk? And also, I would like to, as a second issue, mention Road and Belt Initiative has created this debt. Someone suggested that Sri Lanka debt was 6%, China debt to Sri Lanka was 6%, which is wrong. If you look at the bonds and where they have finally ended up, you would see that much of the debt is to China. Now, Road and Belt has done that. We have a view that there is a very strong Dow trade that existed in the Indian Ocean region. Now, if you revamp, now Mauritius has Port Louis only, but Lamu, Mogadishu, Mombasa, Adan, Coromandel Coast, the Indian western coast, Bay of Bengal, if these ports were developed for smaller cargo, for smaller vessels, I have a feeling that this would bankrupt the megaports. Now, wouldn't that be a better way of addressing the Road and Belt Initiative?
Mr. Kant, over to you. One is how do we respond to climate when we are trying to grapple with economies that are debt-ridden? I think that's the basic question, that there is great economic stress and there is a climate agenda. How do we mobilize money and global support for many of these countries who are seeking to respond to these twin challenges?
So, Samir, much of what was said, unfortunately, I could not hear because the sound was breaking, so I couldn't get the full text of the question. But let me broadly say that it's very important that the multilateral financing institutions, which were structured and institutionalized for the post-World War II era of post-Bretton Woods, they have to be redesigned for the post-COVID climate change era. And without raising a lot of resources through the multilateral financing institutions, including blended finance, including first loss guarantees, including bonds, it will not be able, the developed world will not be able to provide resources to the developing and emerging nations. And therefore, these institutions require a lot of radical change. Having said that, I think in the immediate nature, it's very important that the commitment made by the developed world, which they have made already at COP21 and 26, need to be fulfilled fully. This would also necessitate structuring of new forms of financing. It would necessitate that we finalize our green taxonomy. It would also necessitate that greenwashing is not done. And therefore, it's critical that new financial institutions like blending and first loss guarantees and bonds, green bonds, are put out so as to finance these nations, which is very critical. Without this, it'll be very difficult for these countries to meet their climate targets.
Mr. Kant, I'm now moving to perhaps technology. I'm just taking a wild guess that Nanjira Sambuli, who's fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Kenya, and someone who's been in the high-level panel of the UN Secretary General on technology, maybe she might have a tech question for you.
Sure, thank you, Samir, and good morning. Yeah, actually, it's really simple. What would be India's focus on technology governance specifically? Because in existing multilateral fora, they're fundamentally unrepresentative fora for even India's perspectives with the India Way. I'm curious what you would be prioritizing around issues of governing of technology in a time when technology is increasingly becoming a geopolitical flashpoint issue.
So our belief is that India has demonstrated that through public digital infrastructure, through individual identities, digital identities, through our ability to create public platforms which are open source, which are interoperable, it is possible to scale up innovation in a manner where you are able to lift people above poverty line and enable them to enable benefits to reach them without leakages, enable them to do digital payments, enable them to provide health and education in a much faster manner than going through the big tech route. And therefore, unlike what America has done to create 4 or 5 big monolithic corporates which control your data, India has built public digital infrastructure on top of which private sector has competed. And therefore, in India, you have Google Pay competing with PhonePe. You have Ola competing with Uber. And that is the way forward to our mind. And individuals' digital identity needs to be built. Consent needs to be taken. Individual consent is critical. And building up of public infrastructure is truly the route for a technological future. And that will enable rapid scale innovation to take place. And India has demonstrated through these interoperable, open source, public digital platforms to scale up in a very big manner, both lending, wealth management, as well as digital insurance, which is all paperless, cashless. And therefore, my belief is that in the years to come, the world will look for public digital infrastructure based on public platforms, and that is really the route to the future.
Mr. Kant, let me just a follow-up question to what Manjeera, in fact, maybe just to re-stress what she was suggesting. We hear buzzwords like technology for development, we hear data for development, we hear these catchphrases. Is it time to put together a framework which actually has the designers from the Southern Hemisphere? Can the emerging world be sitting on the high table designing these development architectures of the future, or are we still going to take prescriptions from the West? I think that was what Manjeera was seeking to ask.
No, the future really belongs to what we have done in the developing world. The developing world has demonstrated that there is an alternative technological model where individual identity, their individual data consent, their ability to create public digital platform is critical, and that's a better model for innovation. That's a better model to scale up. That's a better model to lift people above poverty line, to provide health and insurance in an equitable manner. That's a far better model than anything which the developed world has done. And therefore, today, an alternative to the developed world, which has allowed data to be taken by 4 or 5 big companies, has been built up, which can be provide a huge amount of technological disruption.
And hopefully
I also feel that we've also demonstrated that the scaling up of startups is much quicker, much faster if you're able to build up this public digital infrastructure. And that has enabled India to throw up 105 unicorns in a very, very short period of 4 to 5 years. When we started our startup movement in 2016, we just had about 120 odd startups. Today, we have about 78,000 startups, over 105 unicorns. And the scaling up of the startups into unicorns has been much quicker, much faster than what has happened in Silicon Valley and other parts of Europe and America. And therefore, an alternative model has today been thrown up, which can be adapted by both the emerging markets as well as advanced countries.
So let me turn to my friend Andrietta Esterhusen from South Africa, and who's again someone who's been in the tech sector, but she has a much wider ambit of concerns at this stage. So Andrietta, I'm not going to second guess your question.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Samir. Thank you very much for being with us, Amitabh. I have just two questions. One which is tech-focused, one which is not. You emphasize the importance of growth. But do you feel the G20 is also reaching a point where they can look critically at this notion that growth equals development, particularly in the context of how growth also contributes to climate change? And I know there are many buzzwords about green growth and sustainable growth, but do you feel there's perhaps a deeper issue there that we need to re-look at how we see economic development? You talk about the youth of Africa, but actually between Brazil, India, and South Africa, we contribute to about 3/4 of the youth unemployment in the G20, among G20 countries. So yes, just on that question. And then secondly, on technology, you talk about digital public goods, the Summit of the Future and the Global Digital Compact, but you also clearly see, and I agree with you completely, that there are these different models emerging in different parts of the world. What do you see, what hope do you have for the Global Digital Compact to actually shift how we look at the publicness of the internet, at the publicness of the digital sphere? Do you feel there is actually scope for some kind of global agreement on shifting our models in terms of how we think and govern about data and technology?
So defining growth and, of course, the governance models around data and technology. 2 questions for you, sir.
So Samir, first and foremost, accelerated growth is critical. Without accelerated growth, you can't lift people above poverty line. We cannot be distributing poverty. So we need accelerated growth. And accelerated growth would mean that trade has to play a very critical role. Whenever growth has taken place in the world and global economy has grown and expanded, international trade has played a very major role. Unfortunately, global supply chains are impacted at this point of time, and therefore it's very, very critical that in G20, both growth plays a central role. With growth, you can lift people above poverty line. You can have a huge impact on health and education. You can have a huge impact on nutrition. But more importantly, you have a huge impact on climate change. Now, the developing world has not contributed to pollution in the world. They've contributed hardly 1.52% of in the total carbon space that is available. Now, it's important that new technologies are made available. They are made accessible at reasonable interest rates, reasonable costs, so that these countries are able to technologically leapfrog in the world of sustainability of tomorrow. It's not merely renewables, but renewable, wind, solar, and using solar then to crack water, build hydrogen, green hydrogen for tomorrow, so that we are able to decarbonize hard to abate sectors of tomorrow. And these are very, very critical areas of growth, but they would all require funding to take place. I don't want to get into, we are very, very focused on digital public goods. The issue of data, cross-border transactions of data are very complex issues, and they will not allow, there's very little political capital in the world today with the Russia-Ukraine war, with the China-Taiwan conflict. There's very little political capital. And therefore, we should be very, very selective about what we want to achieve. And I think the achievements, to my mind, should be focused around accelerated growth. They should be focused around sustainability, climate adaptation and mitigation, and about using technology to leapfrog digitally across the world, because that is really the answer to many of the problems of health, education, and nutrition. So I think it's very, very important to stay focused, stay clear, stay crisp.
Thank you, sir. Let me come to our last 2 or 3 questions, sir. So thank you so much for indulging us. I'm extending the welcome by posing another few questions from the audience. Let me now turn to, of course, Ambu Mozi Venkatachalam from the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN, and he's based in Indonesia.
Thank you, Sherpa, and good morning. And I had 2 inquiries. One is about the continuity. Second is about the coordination. You mentioned about this continuity of Indonesia and then India and Brazil. Indonesia has adopted a theme of recovering together and recovering stronger. And it has 3 pillars of global architecture for health. Second is energy transformation. Third one is a digital transformation. Under the Indian presidency, what will be continued and what will be the new? My second question is related to coordination with G7 about the global architecture. G20 is a group of advanced economies as well as the emerging big and developing economies. You mentioned about aspirations of the developing countries will be taken care of. But at the same time, G7, that is Japan, will be taking the leadership. And how G20 and G7 will be coordinating, and what could be the role for think tanks and also Niti Aayog in this process? Thank you.
Sir, over to you.
So let me first compliment Indonesia for doing a great job of its presidency despite all challenges, all global complexity. Indonesia has done a wonderful job, and I really want to place on record our appreciation for the detailing, the perfection, the intellectual content, all that Indonesia has provided in a very, very difficult year. We have a great commitment towards the success of G20 at Indonesia, because our belief is that if G20 succeeds in Indonesia, it'll succeed in India, and subsequently it'll succeed in Brazil. It's a challenge not for Indonesia, it's a challenge for the emerging world. And we all need to work together with Indonesia to make it succeed. And this is a point we have made repeatedly at the G20 meeting in Indonesia. And I've particularly made a Sherpa very strongly that we are fully committed for Indonesia. Now, my view is that unlike the UN General Assembly, which is very diffused, a G20 is a fairly focused body. It comprises of both developed and developing world. It comprises of about 85% of the global GDP. It accounts for about 75% of the global trade. And therefore, it is a forum which has made several breakthroughs in the past and is capable of making very many breakthroughs. And we in India will be very, very ambitious to push through major ideas, major issues of debate, major issues of discussion, to work in partnership to take care of many of the global scenarios of the future. I would only say that these are very challenging times, and to bring and discuss and debate other developmental issues will be a challenge, but we are quite hopeful that we'll be able to arrive at issues where there is a consensus as far as economic and social issues are concerned. It cannot be held hijacked by the Russia-Ukraine war. That's an issue which should be discussed in the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. That's not an issue for G20. G20 was designed for economic and social issues, and the focus should remain on economic and social issues.
Let me now turn to Uche Igwe, alumni of and a great old friend, to ask you a question. He is based in Nigeria and has been writing on lots of political stuff. So Uche, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Blue economy is seen as one of the catalysts for Africa's economic resurgence. Not only has it become a buzzword, but then if you consider that 38 African countries live by the coastline, 13 African countries share the coast actually with India. I just wanted to find out what specific plans that India has under the G20 presidency to harness Africa's blue economy potentials and create a pathway for the $405 billion potential investment area, and most importantly, create jobs for the teeming young people in Africa.
I assure you, sir, that we'll bring blue economy center stage because we realize the significance. Our Prime Minister is committed on it. We believe that a very clean and a very developmental-oriented approach to blue economy is critical. These issues are being discussed and debated. We are preparing the issue note on blue economy, and I can assure you that blue economy will form a very, very central point of our debate and discussion in the Sherpa track as we take it forward.
So the final question this afternoon, I promise you, just introduce yourself and your institution and pose the question.
Thank you very much for your very insightful on G20 and the role of G20. My name is Sutikon Kingkya from Thailand. I was part of an OIF fellowship. Yeah, 8 years ago. My question is about the role of G20 in terms of when we look back in history. I mean, India was successful in terms of creating a third pillar when we have Cold War, confronting between US and Soviet Union. So this time again, we will have a confrontation between US and China, and it's coming very alarming. You see, for the past few weeks, we have Pelosi visiting Taiwan, and all the alarm is raising because of that. So through G20, the majority of the members are developing countries, are emerging powers, and how can we develop through maybe G20 through mechanism or something that would prevent the world from diverging into two parallel worlds, supply chains, economies, influence, and so on.
So can G20 prevent Cold War 2.0? Can you create a new model for coexistence? I think that's the question.
So, Samir, that's a tough question, and I really feel that G20 is not the right forum for this. If you get all these issues of Cold War, if you get issues of war and conflict and aggression into G20, the G20 will also not be able to move forward like UN General Assembly. So we should be very, very focused on economic, social issues, developmental issues, not issues of war and conflict. That's the job of the UN General Assembly. And let's not get these issues waded into G20. That will be a very, very wrong approach to take. And if you do that, then G20 will also come to a stalemate. G20 is a rare forum for emerging and developed economies, and it's very important that we work together to ensure that there is growth, there is prosperity, there's sustainability, and we are able to do good to the citizens of the world. Let's not focus on issues which concern the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations General Assembly. Next, G20 should not take over the role of the United Nations Security Council.
That's a good point to close this conversation after thanking you for your time and for indulging us and for engaging with so many questions posed to you. Please join me in thanking Mr. Amitabh Kant for his intervention. And sir, we wish you all the best for the presidency, and hopefully when we have the next Kigali dialogue, we'll be able to steal you for 2 days from your Sherpa duties, have you in person in Kigali, and share the progress of the G20 next year with the folks here in person. Thank you very much for joining us online this time.
Thank you, Samir. Next time I'll be there physically, I can assure you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.